welcome everyone to this very special therapist hour with Dr. Jonathan Egan, who's from Galway, Ireland, and he's been near and dear to the APT heart for, gosh, at least 11 years now, Jonathan, if not longer. Dublin.
Dublin the first time. That's 11 years ago, yeah. And then Limerick, then Galway, yeah.
That's right. That's right. You know, one of the standouts for me happened actually in Dublin when you were working with Alan Carr. And I came out and I did an introduction to affect phobia therapy. But what I noticed most about your work is just how much you would pay attention to the therapist and, you know, what was happening inside the therapist from a somatic perspective. And for me to meet, you know, a team of people who are interested about the subject was really, really thrilling because I had been introduced to it by a supervisor of mine who was in the dance movement therapy arena, as well as the drama therapy arena, but never someone who was from one of my academic communities. So can you tell us more about that?
I suppose going back to Alan Carr's background would be kind of systemic and family theory. And as part of the training, I suppose if you go to the attachment side, if you think about Winnicott's famous phrase that there's no such thing as a baby, there's a mother and baby. So if you think about the unit of relationship is both a mother and child, or a caregiver and care seeker. And that we're very much attuned to each other. And if a mother isn't attuned to a baby, the baby becomes distressed and will react with a protest. We'll go, "Mommy, you're not listening to me. You're not meeting my needs." We'll scream, we'll shout, we'll tighten their body and pull back. And I suppose we really noticed that time in Dublin, you and I, that some of the therapists, when they were connecting with clients, would have that same shift backwards in the chair when they were either feeling that they would not catch the client, or the client was feeling that the therapist wouldn't catch them, wasn't getting them, wasn't attuned, wasn't connected. And you and I work very well together. We're very connected when we work together as co-therapists or co-trainers. So much so that if Kristin is working with a client and I can't even see the front of the client, I often will pick up through Kristin's countertransference and presence what exactly is going on with the client. And I can work and show the rest of the audience or the people we're training what I think is happening, and they're stunned and think we have some kind of magic powers. But no, it's just the mirror neurons. It's just the kind of the ability to really attune to another person. And what that does when we work together is it gives Kristin extra information that, you know, you're working so hard, it might be hard to pick up what else might be happening in the caregiving of the therapist who's training, or the explorative kind of training and understanding and learning, or with the client. And it just adds an extra dimension. Also, it calms, if you ever work in a dyad, it calms the caregiver. So I can calm Kristin if she gets overwhelmed or gets into a place of confusion, or if her body loses tone or the vitality goes. I can jump in and bring back that vitality and give extra information non-verbally or verbally. So it's we're really becoming aware, and you really, in your book Paraverbal, if you want to mention about that you really bring in the idea that the system is the therapist and the client. You can't, that is the thing you have to look at. If we only look at the client, we're looking at half the story.
Yeah, two is one is none. Right? And we really find like there's the synergy that happens between a patient and a therapist. And what you helped me understand, Jonathan, was how important it was, like, for me as a therapist to be really taking care of myself and really paying attention to what's happening inside of me, mostly to see like what support do I need in order to be this attuned and this intuitive with my patients. You know, I came into the field very intuitive. And so I was just giving without receiving and getting the support that I needed.
Yeah.
And when you joined training with me and you started paying attention to what was happening to me as the therapist, as well as all the other therapists in the room, that was a real game changer.
Yeah, and you know what really was amazing was I learned from the attachment theory. I was working with vets who were working with children, and I was working with in your groups in Stockholm with people who were working with children who were maybe on the spectrum or are very traumatized, who worked with animals, with horses, with different, and they could tell that that children who were so frightened of human contact but could manage contact through animals, and they could tell through the reaction of the animal and the client what was happening, and the information there was just phenomenal, and really helps people get into the relational aspect and at the body level, and that really struck me as well, that some of the therapists were feeling more like vets by the end of their training, that they were able to observe the pupil dilation, the changing color and tone of the client, whether the client's hands were getting cold, whether their legs were getting cold, whether the vitality was reducing, almost like a vet would do when the dog walks in, when a lovely Great Dane walks in, and you're assessing the vitality of the animal.
Right.
And that vitality changes when there's either fear or calm in the presence of other people. So it's very moving. And what I suppose Kristin and I will be talking to you today about, and to be very gentle with yourself. And we want you to really to amplify the self-compassion, that these feelings you'll get could be the client's, they could be yours, they could be trauma, they could be the body remembering, or they could be both. We often see in the training of therapists, well, this kind of parallel process, that when the client is somatizing, that soon afterwards the therapist will somatize, and will get a headache, or will get back pain, or vitality will go down. And it's often because the client is coming in and is telling the story about the therapist, but the therapist hasn't realized yet.
Can you say that again, Jonathan?
So the parallel process is apparent to everybody outside in the training group, but for the therapist and the client. There's a collusion of defense. There's a collusion of the body defense. There's a collusion of the relational defense. And it's almost like two siblings saying, let's be quiet, daddy's coming home. There's parts of way of relation that we need to and people were blind to that. I'm blind to it. Kristin's blind to it. Everybody's blind to it. So it's really useful in the training setting to videotape ourselves. And
right.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the times where the parallel processes happen between supervisee and supervisors. So you have the patient and the therapist, and then you have the supervisee and the supervisor, and there's like 3 parallel processes happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's something that I have very much enjoyed kind of working through with you, because when I'm looking at a video recording of a therapist and the patient, and the therapist is there for supervision, then what's happening between me and that therapist that's there for supervision, and having you there to witness and to also help draw my attention to when the countertransference can even begin on my side. So
it's so interesting. We bring the clients who we think we've done the best work with to our supervision to show off, and it's often that client who is the client where we're really having a strong countertransference to our relational mirroring of our own story. We're totally unconscious to it. So that's why I'm saying be very gentle with this. If you work with animals and children, and you're drawn to certain types, there's maybe a mirror reason why you're getting drawn. Almost akin to a therapist when they say my best quality is compassion. Often the reason their compassion is so strong is because they were not treated in a compassionate way as a child. So it's always be very gentle with people, that the reason they have a strength in one area often means that the weak, it comes from a very darker place or less held place. And that less held place also reflects in the body. The body will be less held. The vitality won't be as good. The voice won't be as strong. The feet on the ground, the warmth and vitality going through the body won't be as good. And we have information about that, I suppose, we know that trauma is related to more likelihood of getting autoimmune disorders, of having problems with your gut, moving away from the kind of fibrous muscles and going into the body, that the systems within the body of all the hollow organs will get more activated. So that if you're like me, if I get very frightened, I will have an urgency to go to the toilet, for number one. And so that's my sign of this real fear here. And other people will have a sudden migrainous type headache occurring. Other people will have a feeling of wanting to vomit, or a load of very toxic kind of bilious presentation in the stomach. Other people will get a lot of pain in their tummy.
Mm-hmm.
So we get more information from people depending on where they present their pain, or if they're locked. So at the very start, maybe we'll do it before we go into this discussion, because it could unlock things, or be gentle. Just to put your feet on the ground, everybody, and to, just notice the ground supporting your feet beneath, and to travel up your ankles, your shins, your calves, taking the bend at your knee, noticing if you've got the same vitality in your lower body as you do up in your upper body. Or is there a lock? Is there a lockdown in your lower spine? Moving into your sitting bones, I want you just to sit. And this is very important before every therapy session with a client, to make sure that you're in a good sitting position, so that the energy is flowing up and down very easily. Your vitality is equal in the upper body to the lower body. So as you're sitting, to decide whether your hands will be paired together, clasped, or if you want to leave them on your lap, or just leave them some very comfortable. Some people even leave it on their belly. Whatever is comfortable for you. Next, we always check with the breath to see that we're not going into upper chest breathing, that when we breathe in, that we're breathing into the diaphragm and breathing into the abdomen, so that we've got a full breath coming in. The bigger breath out is very important, because that relaxes our autonomic nervous system. Good. Moving up your lower vertebrae of your back and spine, notice as you go between your shoulders, if they're tight or loose, and just to move them, to relax them, particularly if you've just done 20 client sessions in a row. There's going to be a need to want to be held yourself, to want to be taken care of, to want to, and sometimes if we didn't experience that as a child, there'll be a tightness in your scapula and tightness between your shoulders. Up to your neck and spine, just make sure your heavy head is balancing very easily on top of your neck and spine. Good. And just notice with your eyes if there's vitality, or if you're tired of the eyes. It's good to move your eyes left to right or up and down, just to check into the body, to see if your vitality is there. And lately as well, when you talk to dentists, a lot of people are getting tightness in their jaws because of the frustration of COVID and their life being put on hold. So just to check and see if there's tightness there, and to try and stretch the jaw gently. And often it's good to do it for 20 or 30 seconds later this evening when you go to bed, to check and see if there's tightness in your jaw, if you're grinding your teeth, or if there's tension and pain in your TMJ. Okay. Good. So we're all starting to feel a bit more present. The part that therapists often forget is when you're when you're in inhibition or in the anxiety pole, that often people are looking for guilt, and they're looking for the somatic reaction of tension across here in the chest, aren't they? And we try and differentiate that from pain in the sternum or the throat, which could be grief or loss. But when we get anxious or fearful, our body tightens and prepares itself for a possible danger, or anticipates. But also, if it's held too long, can turn into a tremor. And with shame, we will see the nonverbals of the looking away, the covering the face with the hand. And the important bit which we miss out on is the emotional pain. That the reason why we go into inhibition is to stop us going towards affect, which is adaptive. In the context of your family, of growing up as a child, you learn which affect to avoid, because you get hit, or you get denigrated, you get shamed. So it's adaptive for us to try and feel at a body level pulling away from going towards the adaptive affect. We become frightened of it. We develop a phobia of it. It sometimes is dissociated from us. We don't get angry. We don't get sad. That's something else that I need to project into other people, so that I can even look at that emotion. But the emotional pain bit is the part that people forget, particularly with grief, or with any emotion you can't access. The body will tighten so much in different places that it will actually be physically painful when we move towards that feeling the person's projecting out or not being able to go towards. And sometimes as therapists, when it hurts, we pull away and go, oh, I'm really sorry, that's too painful for you. When it's actually a sign of, I'm in inhibition, I'm in fear, and this is coming in relation to you getting a bit too close to me. It could be closeness. It could be related to you getting too close to my anger or my vulnerability. So that the body tightens up and goes into pain to say, don't go there. This is too painful for me. And the average person in the family will go, oh, I'm really sorry, and pull away. And sometimes in new therapists, they'll do the same until they meet their supervisor and goes, no, we need to go in there to regulate the person's feelings, their anxiety, and to try and move into the body. Kristin, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as I'm listening to you, Jonathan, there's two things that are coming to mind. It's like paying attention to what's happening for the patient while also paying attention to what's happening for you.
Yeah.
And the more you know yourself and your story, and you know how you process and heal, the more able you are to tell, is this about me, right? And my work, or am I just so attuned to this patient that I'm really picking up on what's happening for them too?
Exactly. So there could be a case of you've got really well developed mirror neurons, and that literally you're even tasting and feeling the person's true body feelings before they're able to even feel it themselves. And sometimes we'll react with a little bit of inhibition, which is good inhibition, when we see an incongruent micro flash of an emotion across the client's face or a therapist's face, which doesn't fit with what the words they're telling you, doesn't fit with the intention or the moving towards closeness when they smile and this micro flash of a snarl towards your contempt, letting you know what their internal world is really like, or part of their internal world, and that you could be a lookalike for them. And if we were keeping ourselves in the pleasant therapist role, we might not realize we're having a similar reaction to that micro expression that we're not really aware of.
Well, also, Jonathan, what we've seen in studying video recordings of therapy is when a patient is transferring their feelings onto the therapist, a lot of times the therapist will begin to mimic the attachment figure.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, we'll see a therapist who's normally sitting straight up in their chair begin to slouch as if they're looking depressed.
Exactly.
and responding in like a slower, methodical
Mhm.
way, and they're just not presenting the way that they normally do, and that will be an indicator that the
Yeah.
therapist is so attuned
Yeah.
that they're almost manifesting the traits of the attachment figure, and creating a fertile ground to do the
It's
transference work.
absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And it gets into the garish when there's Schadenfreude, when there's a parent or a teacher or somebody who gets enjoyment out of hurting somebody.
Mhm.
That face can come on the client and they or the therapist, and they might not be aware of that. And it's
Mhm.
good information. Often the client or we will have the face of our parent on our face without us being aware. The same face of the parent who enjoyed hitting, or the parent who enjoyed sexually abusing, or in really difficult cases where a person was sexually abused and there was orgasm in the face of the abuser, that face can sometimes come, and it will give you a shock as a therapist when you see it, and you'll go, because the person's not aware of it, but they've taken it in. They've taken in what's happened. They've taken in the face of the pleasure of the abuser into their face, and it can really give you that kind of feeling of you want to dissociate to protect yourself from that. You'll get the hairs standing up on your body, the feeling of catching your breath and the shock. And when I work with people in chronic pain, often the area of pain that they're having can be related to either sexual trauma or an actual physical trauma. And that going into that pain area brings back the trauma, and going back to the trauma brings back the pain. So you have this never ending loop of amplified, kind of habituated. It amplifies and gets worse and worse right throughout the person's life, unless you have to slow both down to separate them and bravely help the person come to see what the body's remembering. And that's very difficult if it's nonverbal or it's in a pre-memory phase. But you just
Absolutely.
know there's information there that the person's remembering. My
Yeah.
little mouth.
I
Yeah,
think
go on.
that's why we emphasize the importance of like awareness and acceptance. just, helping our patients be really aware of what is happening in their body and being able to accept it with curiosity and openness, but also expecting the therapist to be very aware and open to not only what they're witnessing with the patient, but what's happening inside of them as well.
Right.
And that curiosity, if you really trust the process, there's
Mm.
always a bridge that transpires. It's sort of
Yeah.
like knowing that when patients become resistant, that's when they're most engaged, and you just have to like kind of ride the wave of resistance. And
Yeah.
then suddenly you have like a stronger therapeutic alliance, and the work begins to move much more quickly.
And to be gentle to yourself, knowing that if you're getting towards the physical pain or the emotional need of a client, a lot of anger and rage can come up and transference to the therapist, because
Mhm.
you're going to a place that the yearning is so, the lost love is so strong, the yearning is so strong, that the lack of being held doesn't want a person ever to hope for being cared
Mhm.
for, doesn't ever hope for being, some clients, if you touch them, they suddenly jump. A bit like Ryan Gosling and Lars and the Real Girl, where the GP psychologist put her hand on him, and she said, "What's that like when I touch your arm?" And he said, "That's painful. It burns. It burns." And so it's a somatic defense that occurs there because his mother died in childbirth with him, and he never received that loving attention and being assuaged and being soothed. Um,
And
in
Jonathan,
therapists, yeah,
I
go on.
just want to make a point that like it's really important from an affect
Yeah,
perspective that you're accepting of all feelings, even if it doesn't make sense to you or you haven't read it in a book. Like there's like you have to be really open to all feelings that the patient is experiencing, because what they are aware of and what they're able to articulate out loud and share with you a lot of times is the gateway to the trauma that they need to begin to work through.
yeah,
But if you're projecting, right, if you have your assumptions, you can really like miss these messages from the unconscious
yeah,
that will say, go in this direction, right?
yeah.
And also, being really aware of your own unconscious work, your shadow work, and just how the unconscious manifests is really helpful too.
Yeah. So what we do is we slow the person right down. We regulate their anxiety, their inhibition. And often what Kristin will do is we'll ask the therapist to just go into your body, what's happening in your body. So there's a form of anchoring, and you can tell if that's the true place of the feeling that's been blocked, or if it's just inhibition, or if it's the client's projection into them from a client who's very fragile, and they're getting confused. They think it's them, they're not sure. The introjection is so strong. So we can really, when you slow down and get people to put words onto what's happening and to see if the physical thing moves or can change, we know that it's a somatic presentation in the person that might not be theirs. That could be someone else's, or it could be a lookalike for part of their own thing. It might be just in the client, it might be the solar plexus. For somebody else, it might be just here in the sternum. So that might be very close in the body to what's happening. I would love to show some of the common body centers. Remember Perlman, Lorianne Perlman and Zach Whitney wrote the brilliant book on trauma and the therapist back in 1994 or 1996. And they brought up the term body-centered countertransference. Other people would talk about embodied countertransference, somatic countertransference. We're all talking about the same thing. But Kristin and I did, this is like the fourth study, I think, but it's the biggest study we've done recently in Irish therapists. We don't know if it could be a societal effect of Irish therapists. If I share a screen and go into here, and to show you, when we asked people in the last 6 months how often they experience certain body reactions in therapy, the most common one that people get is muscle tension. So we can work with that. That this is inhibition, it's muscle tension, and in some cases it could be bad posturing, but something's happened to the vitality that the person needs to address. Tearfulness. If we look at the female therapists, 3/4 of them talked about being tearful. When I trained back in 92 to 97, you would be shamed as a therapist if you told your supervisor that you had a tear in your eye, that you had strong affect coming up. Whereas now we're moving into the kind of the revolution of emotion. and praising the therapist who's able to hold all different strong affects, not get over, who's able to regulate themselves and stay with the client, even if there's very strong feeling coming up, and to be able to use supervision. Sleepiness is really interesting, and people often laugh when I can't see everybody here because I've got my screen up, but people laugh with relief and laugh with anxiety, kind of hysterical laughter when they see sleepiness, because some clients, for some reason, make us tired. And it's often the client who isn't really in the right process. They're in the never-ending analysis of the false self that Winnicott would talk about. They're not talking about reality. They're in the pretend person, what they learned from their parents and other people to be. And sometimes if we get annoyed at that and we aren't able to assert our congruence and say, well, really, I'm not really picking up what you're saying. It's just something that's not fitting with me. Some therapists will go into sleepiness or tiredness as a defensive reaction. Do you want to say anything about that, Kristin?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I unfortunately deal with sleepiness on my end. Every time it comes up for me, I just ask myself, what is it that my patient is not connecting with right now? And sometimes I've been known to say, you know what, the sleepiness just hit me. And can we just pause right now and let's see how connected you are? And are you really allowing yourself to feel what's happening inside? And then the sleepiness is gone and we're back to work. So.
And sometimes we've just really at a core level, there's a narcissistic client or a client who is going dominant on us, and we go sleepy because we want to rip their throat out. We're holding back rage towards the client. And that sleepiness is kind of an adaptive defensive switch.
Jonathan, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think the hardest thing that I see with therapists is their ability to accept that they feel enraged with their patients.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I'll get calls for supervision or consultations because I'm working with a therapist who doesn't allow themselves to experience feelings of rage toward their patients. And so therefore they begin to, respond in phobic ways in sessions.
And we know that you'll see it in the hands, or you'll see it in the jaw,
Yeah.
the tightening, or being held back, and micro expressions. So it's often good to really slow down and explore what's happening in the jaw. What would your mouth like to do if you stop the client speaking and just went back into yourself and really slowed down time? What is it you want to do? Often you'll see therapists holding their hand really tightly, and their hand will go, their wrist and their hand will go really like red, like a red hand. And it's just that they're holding back the anger, the frustration. If you've had a narcissistic parent, it would have been very adaptive to hold back that, because it would have been very dangerous to punch that parent or to tell them to shut up or slap them. So yawning comes in very closely there. There's one error in this table. This is the pre-publication one, but I'll share this article with everybody in a minute. Headache, throat constriction. That's really what is happening when a person, sometimes it's when in the room when people are lying, therapists will get the, or if the therapist's lying themselves, their throat will get constricted. We'll see that also later on, some people lose their voice, and that really comes in when there's a power imbalance or when there's pure fear there. And if you look at Alan Abbas's work in ISTDP, he will look at that, where he'll get a client to engage in anger, to be their true self, to overcome the fear that stops the muscles of the larynx working, that there's muscle tension, dysphonia, and he'll engage in that with the ventral vagus nervous system. Headache. So in the middle of a session, you suddenly get a headache in relation to a client's presentation in front of you. Really interesting. So it could be you're feeling a bit run down, you've a headache, but often it can be a somatic defense of the client. Or I can't possibly work today because I have lower back pain, or my neck pain's really getting me, or my migraine's in. But the headache, if you focus and help a therapist work through it, to try and move it around, to see what the essence of what the meaning of the somatic reaction is, when we put it into words, then it seems to disappear or dissipate, or go, oh, my headache's gone now, Kristin. Have you ever worked, Kristin, with therapists with headaches?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all the time. And, You know, I'm just teaching therapists how to pay attention to their own triangles when they're working, and to just get curious about, why did your headache arrive at this moment? Let's rewind. Let's see what happened with the patient and understand what was happening inside of you,
Yeah.
because it's clearly a defense. So the anxiety became too high for the therapist, and the defense gets activated. And then the question's why? And is it what's happening with the patient? Is it what's happening with the therapist? Is it a combination of the two? Uh, it's always fun to just begin the exploration to understand, and then to try and heal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did a study recently with 1,100 therapists, and the therapists who had the more physiological reactions often had previous trauma history. It doesn't make them any less a good therapist, but it does mean they need to really keep an eye on their physiological responses and to really take care of their body, because the body, the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, gets dysfunctional. People get you'll often see these therapists when they go to the doctor that they have a higher heart rate, resting heart rate, than the average person. And there's a bigger change in blood pressure and stuff. So keep an eye on your physiology there, because you could be reacting without even knowing. Stomach disturbance is really, but before we go to stomach disturbance, this one is actually incorrect. See the 123 people here, that unexpectedly shifting in your body. This is what's called a hypnic jerk. Do you know when you go to bed at night and you feel like you're dropping from 3 feet above the bed? Okay, so that's when we're changing blood pressure, we're sleeping, and there's a change. But it can happen when we're going to dissociation, when we're starting to literally lose ourselves with the client. And so about 3/4 of the clients or the therapists were getting this. It's where you're sitting with somebody and suddenly your arm moves, or you a sudden shift. And what's happening is we're actually going into a hypnic trance. And that's a form of kind of absorption. And that's a really big predictor of burnout, the therapists who go into absorption. Male therapists, if you look at Shaw's work and different people, male therapists we tend to avoid and distance ourselves from clients when we start to get into that level of arousal that's going to cause a hypnic reaction. Female therapists, more than male, will tend to become over-identified and over-connected, so that the self and other, the mine and thine, gets distorted. And what can happen then is the old reenactments can occur. It's like watching a movie screen and there's actually another movie on the back of the other screen. Two things are happening at the same time. So it's a really thing if you're having those hypnic jerks, to keep an eye on that. Bruce or anybody, do you have any thoughts about that? Is anybody in the audience who wants to comment? Or no? Okay. Sexual arousal. Be really nice to yourself if you're a female therapist or male therapist here. When unspoken body reactions are not spoken about, when a therapist has experienced sexual abuse or rape, it can often result in the therapist picking that up. When you hear narratives about trauma, it's adaptive for the female body to become aroused so that the biological organs do not get damaged. So some female therapists at work would get very frightened that the body was reacting in a sexually aroused way. But I'm going to explain, some of the research shows that if you get a female therapist to listen to consensual sex, or listen to a rape, a scene that's being set up, that their body and the clitoral HUD of female therapists will get activated. And the reason why they think it has to happen is because if in a case of rape, that would protect your reproductive organs, if that makes sense. So be very gentle to yourself if that's happening. This could be a normal biological response. One good news, Kristin, is that the body-centered countertransference seems to be pretty much universal in male and female therapists, and very little difference. Wow. So it seems like it's our mirror neurons, it's our reactions, it's our somatic defense. It's really interesting when we're watching people, if suddenly you're supervising a therapist and their voice gets louder and louder towards their trainer. And there's something, and then what happens when you listen to the trainer, the voice starts to parallel, go in a louder voice. Or if you're, I used to be a trauma service manager, where you hear the client's voice getting louder and louder and louder, and you hear both sets of voices getting louder. Remember David Finkelhor's work on traumatic sexualization. And he would say that power is one of the key things about abuse, and the sense of power. If the voice isn't getting loud and going dominant, sometimes people lose their voice. Their voice disappears. And it's very frightening as a therapist when you're with a client who's very powerless and very traumatized, for you to suddenly go, and at a mirror neuron level, you're suddenly picking up the inability to engage the vocal cords, which happens in severe trauma. In the Bataclan in Paris, in 9/11, people who could not use their voice and collapsed, had dorsal vagal activation, demobilization response. Some of them kept safe from not moving. In Bataclan in Paris, by going why she couldn't feel, they had bradycardia, they couldn't feel the pulse, complete whiteness and all the retreat of the blood down to into the internal organs. And that saved them. So the same thing happens with the voice of some therapists, but it's an indication of either severe trauma in the client or in the therapist, and dissociation. Anything that's jumping out, the genital pain we discovered is often related to attack. That it's a rare one that the therapists get. There are many things that aren't on the list here, like your goose pimples, goosebumps aren't here. We can look at, I think we will look again with therapists, but maybe more in a one-to-one immediate response. Nausea is quite frequent as well, to feel like you want to vomit when you hear certain things.
I think, Jonathan, just making sure that I say this out loud, that when you are really aware of yourself and what happens for you naturally, if you're in a session and all of a sudden you do feel genital pain, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of do an internal scan and
Yeah.
you're like, I don't think this is fine. It can be an indicator that there is rage that the patient is feeling towards you.
Yeah,
and the
definitely.
simplest thing to do is to say, hey, can you just check in with yourself and see what feelings are coming up here with me right now? It's not like I announce, oh, genital pain happening now, right? It's just like a signal.
No, it's not like,
ask
my testicles are sore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose I probably defended against that. I felt my body tighten up a bit when he said that. So it's probably, yes, it's when there's sexualized rage towards the therapist that can be really overwhelming and frightening.
Absolutely.
But yeah, definitely.
Yeah. One thing that has been really helpful, Jonathan, in our work together, and I learned this from Habib Davanloo, is really focusing in on emotional honesty and helping your patients become more emotionally honest with themselves about their feelings, about what's happened to themselves. But that means we have to do that too, in order for it to work well. Yeah. So
you're going into a vulnerable place with the client. It's like what Darlene Ehrenberg would have spoken about, getting kind of into the water with the client or the patient, holding them in the pool of muddy water. And being in there yourself. It's the kind of stickiness of relationships and the fear we get there with clients, and that it will bring up hugely strong emotions at every level of you in reaction to the client. And you could feel shame. If you go to shame there, that's where the supervision is so important. To be very gentle with yourself, and a good supervisor who picked that up will soothe you to a place that you could take whatever shameful aspect you've interjected or whatever shame you've blocked from your own life when you've been controlled or put in a place where you never believed you would be. And sometimes we just say that's fine, and we don't actually process the material. That's really important to do that in the supervision setting.
So Jonathan, we have some questions that are coming from the audience. Are you ready to shift into Q&A?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. The first one is, I would like to hear more about how to deal with the garish resonance.
Yeah.
So important not to get into an enactment, but difficult when you are in such an attuned state. Yeah.
We've met this a few times in the supervision setting in Sweden, where the therapist and client will be talking about, at a very surface level, some issues. But when we look at the supervision tapes, we'll see a sexualization in the client that the therapist is not picking up, but the therapist is getting very upset and not realizing why, and feeling very blocked or feeling very de-skilled. So sometimes it is about helping the client or the therapist to see some of the garish elements which are present that they are blocking and they cannot see. And it could be the way I blocked a little bit there, the genital pain, and not realizing, yes, of course, it could be an interjection of sexualized rape or aggression from the client towards us. Because we put ourselves in this kind of simplified wounded healer role where we're here to help people. That means we're good. But really, there's very different levels of complexity from that. And that the garish element of where we want to, particularly with rage, help a person get into a protective place where they have their own boundaries again because they've been violated. We need to get them to release towards, and to, if it's safe, obviously if the person has had a rape history or has physically assaulted people, we wouldn't go in here. But we'd want to use some of Davin Liu's types of approach, wouldn't we, where we want them to get in, to move from the collapsed internal space, from the reaction. You'll hear the burp, you'll hear the poor tummies going crazy. We want to get them to move into the more physical. What do you want to do if you could have escaped that situation? To give a person, to empower them. I worked with a group over the weekend where I got them to, the client had, or the therapist had a difficulty connecting with anger. And I got them to what do you do when you're a child, when you feel angry? And she said, I used to stamp my heels into the ground. And I thought it was a lovely thing that a child would do. So I said, well, and there was a group of people there, we all did it. And then I got her up and to move into a power position. Right. And then she started stamping her feet, and the whole group of therapists started stamping their feet with her. And something happened then. When the therapists all sat down, about half of the group started shaking and having a shivering reaction. And it's almost like Stephen Porges' polyvagal reaction, that when the animal gets free and safe, there's a huge release of energy. And I saw this within the group, and I wasn't expecting it. I thought I was moving towards this empowerment and getting the person to feel in their own control and their own authentic place. But it brought a huge release out in half the therapists. That they said it was like a threshold moment, that they'd held back the rage and the assertion of self, and that really moved them, and they didn't realize that they were actually holding back the assertion, the rage, the ability to say no, to stop. So it's very moving. And if we stay in the shallow waters with clients or therapists, it means that we'll avoid those garish parts. So that's what I think you said earlier, Kristin, about being brave enough to go into those elements and to help regulate somebody when they pick up interjects, or that someone sees that. Some clients have such good mirror neuron systems themselves, but they're traumatized mirror neuron systems. They'll pick up your own trauma in a second. They'll know you've gone through the same thing, and you can't really hide. They'll okay, you're a survivor just like me, or you've got similar issues, and I can work with you. But then they get blocked at a certain level where you can't go. So I think that's really important, Kristin, when there's a vitality block in the therapist.
Well, I also want to bring this up, Jonathan, like, yeah. I think we have to give ourselves the permission to ask those questions that come to us when we're doing psychotherapy. And there's a part of us that's saying, don't ask that question, right? Yeah. Like when you're working, with the transference, and all of a sudden a question transpires in your mind, like, give yourself permission to ask. It is the right moment when it happens. And so many of us will dismiss these kind of intuitive questions that rise to the surface that are just arriving at the right time, and it's the right question to ask, even if it feels like a hard one.
Yeah, so if we become inhibited as a therapist, we're losing that natural flow. Sometimes, I think it was some Italian therapist used to tell me about, Kristin, it's when the client is presenting, holding out the baby in front of you, and you don't pick the baby and take the baby with a frenzy or somebody. The clients do that all the time. They show you the truth symbolically or in their body or something, that if you don't just say, my gut, my mind, my intuition is saying this, and go with it. We miss those special moments, and they might take another couple of years to come back to, or a couple of months, or depending if you don't catch it. It can be essential.
The beauty of the two triangles is you always have this lovely structure to support you through this process. So even if you feel overwhelmed with, the somatic countertransference or the content, just being able to use your triangles gives you the support that you need in order to like be brave and courageous. It's really helpful.
Yeah, and it's relational. So if it's relational trauma, it needs to be cured in a corrective emotional relationship. Some people, we go off and write books, but they don't really help a person because they're still working in their own internal working models with that book to try and help themselves. It's often needed, the correction needs to occur in a person who can regulate and connect to that very deep level, and who's the courage, the new word, the braveness, the courage to say, I think we're onto something here.
Yeah.
I think we both know what's happening here.
Yeah.
And to talk about what's happening. And that's very curative when another person meets you and gets you and understands and just says the truth. And it's very emotional. It's like, I did some research recently with 9 women whose babies were taken from them 40 years ago. And they felt anxious and in a state of inhibition and anxiety all their lives until about a year or 2 ago, when they met their adult children. And when they met the adult children, they had all these women had memories of the baby screaming and wanting mommy when they've been taken away from them. And that call to rescue the child, the call to care give to the child, didn't turn off until they met the adult child 40, 50 years later.
Right.
So it's remarkable how much our goal-corrected systems, our affect systems, when they're blocked, they're calling out for 40, 50, 60 years. There's a yearning to go in that direction, but we get inhibited, don't we? And there's shame there, or there's a holding back. We have to have defenses to hold ourselves back from something which could kill us.
And that's why, talking about the affect of love is such an important part of the work that we do, because really we're teaching people how to be loving toward themselves and how to be loving with one another. And it's important that within the therapeutic relationship, we're allowing people the opportunity to give and receive. Right?
Yeah.
That it's not just a therapist giving to a patient, it's also therapists being able to receive from their patient too.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, when you talk, you make all these references to these books and articles, and I know that all of us want to kind of dive in and really learn what you do know about this work. Can you just say out loud, like, your favorite books, your favorite articles, and maybe could you follow up with an email to Lori so she can ship it out to everyone? Yeah.
A lot of the references will be, I've just sent everybody a copy of that recent publication that Kristin and I did. And in that, it refers to the original Perlman and Lori Ann Perlman, who's a psychologist in the US, her original book on trauma and the therapist. She did it with Zach Whitby, which is a phenomenal book. And it really is a helpful thing for trauma therapists. I know it's old, it's 1996 or something, but it's still, it's one of those seminal books to read. That otherwise it refers to works like Shaw and some of the body work therapists as well, and so they're in the list of if I open up the thing for you, you'll be able to see it here. Now if I go to share screen, so that's
read the article, get the books.
Yes, so you read the article, the books are here.
It's at
so the very first one's there. Great. It was 1995. I was wrong, but it's one of the best books ever written. It's an APA book, and it's called Trauma and the Therapist, Countertransference and Vicarious Traumatization. Really, really super book. And then some of the kind of bodywork therapists, Stone would be a big one, who looks at the analyst's body as a tuning fork. That's really interesting because it's coming from the analytic side, but Val Voskett in Scotland or in England would talk about, you're not an effective therapist unless you use your body as a tuning fork. You need to reverberate and to listen to the energy and the sound of the body of the other person, and to use your body to pick up the changes. That's what I love when people who work with animals then work with clients, because they can really pick up these bodily changes, the fear system. They can pick up the inhibition much quicker than other people.
Well, and Jonathan, like we're so excited about dog whisperers and horse whisperers.
Yeah.
What about people whisperers? I mean, let's do it.
Well, I think, yeah, there's definitely, and that can really frighten therapists if you're an empath, if you really do connect. And I suppose that's one thing which is really important if you're training people, is to have another person there to help regulate your attachment system, your affect. Because what will happen is you will receive all the interjects of the unmet needs of every trainee in the room, every therapist in the room, every client that's there. Particularly if you're talking to a group of 400 people, some people leave and they get a headache, they feel terrible, they have to have a bath and go to bed. It's because they aren't regulating themselves, and they're picking up in their body at an empathic level all the issues of everybody in front of them and their lookalikes. If you've got 200 people in an audience, you're bound to have a couple of people who are like your father, a couple of people like your mother, a couple of people like your teacher. And our brain naturally selects out the dangerous people there. And if you get feedback then after your talk, and 400 people were there and 396 people say it was brilliant, and Lisa says it was terrific and it really changed your life, for a lot of us, because of where we come from, we'll focus on the 4 people who want to kill us, and we'll be devastated that the person says, you should never speak again, Kristin. Lisa, you should never speak again. Bruce, you should never go and do Skype stuff again. That will just actually hit the person at our core self, our keystone system of, and really terrorizes. So to be really gentle in those situations. So it's really important. If I'm doing training with therapists, I'll have a co-therapist to support me. If I'm doing a large workshop with a few hundred people, I will ask a couple of people I know who are supportive of me to sit in the audience, and I'll tell the talk to them. I will scan the audience, because I don't want to be triggered by negative internal working models who could upskittle me, who could make me become disfluent, who can make me become less able to communicate the really important messages or learnings which I'm getting through working with people at this very deep level. So it's very important to be very nice to yourself and realize, yes, we do need support, that we do need to have. There's a war against being supervised, I think, in a lot of the different states and different countries. That, there's no benefit to the client. There's benefit to us, though. There's a big benefit on regulating ourselves.
I'm so glad you're mentioning this, Jonathan, because every therapist needs a team of support, like personally and professionally, like 5 or 6 people who are just a part of their inner group that they can lean into and be completely open with boundaries, right? But to be really open about what's happening and what you need, and to also get consults from too.
Yeah, definitely. I can't believe the hour is over, Kristin.
I know, Jonathan. I can't believe
it feels like 10 minutes.
A way to start our week, though. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we love having you. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks.
So yeah, so everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Therapist Hour, and we'll see you next month. And again, Jonathan, it was great having you, and I can't wait to dive into all those different books that you're recommending. So
brilliant.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.